Here's our next question sent to CornyDriveThru at gmail.com from Noah in Greater Boston.
Do you know Noah?
I don't know this Noah, no.
I've never known Noah before.
I've always wondered how it can possibly be somewhat accurately determined which wrestler drew money in a sold-out show, be it house, network, or pay-per-view. So many people went to see Hogan and Flair during their heydays, of course, but not necessarily towards the end, and certainly not at the very end. In my case, I would rather see Honky Tonk Man wrestle a match in person and pay to see that than the Ultimate Warrior, for example. To each his own. When Stone Cold and The Rock and Triple H and Undertaker and Foley and Big Show were all headlining, but not all headlining at the same time, how could it be determined, and who would decide based on any objective, empirical evidence, how to allocate who drew money and who did not draw as much? Thanks. Seems undiscernible to me, but you know more. Hoping to get an answer soon. Please write back here.
Hoping to get the end of the question soon.
Also, I might miss the podcast that you addressed this on, but I will keep listening. Okay, well, you get the question. It kind of trailed off at the end, but we hope you hear this, Noah.
Well, it's not as easy to determine specifically who drew money in wrestling as it is. You can't quantify it necessarily like you can an album of the Rolling Stones that sold this, or ticket sales for Led Zeppelin, they sold this, because it's one act, it's one product from one. This is not even like football, where it's a team versus another team. This is a bunch of individuals on the wrestling event. Commonly, rule of thumb, going back to the early days of wrestling and boxing, for that matter, was that the main event's the one that drew the money. And that was, without question, almost always the case, 100% of the time, through the pioneer days and into the television era and etc. And you can basically make the argument with any heavyweight boxing championship match or heavyweight wrestling title match that those are the biggest stars on that card. They're in the main event. That's the match people pay to see. Everything else fills out the show. Over the years in the television era with the territories, then still it was pretty obvious. When the old timers from the 50s, the Vern Gagnes and the Bruisers, and even the Roy Shires, and when they booked a card, generally, again, the main event was by far the strongest match. Sam Muchnick, especially to the day he retired in St. Louis, paid the main event multiple times what everybody else on the card got, because that was what you did. But then Watts and Eddie Graham, and later on Jerry Jarrett and Dundee working with Jarrett and Lawler just like to book a bunch of matches. But they started booking package shows where even up and down the card, even if you've still got the guys that are your top guys in the main event, or your area's championship is in the main event, your card is 4 or 5 matches deep, maybe 6 in the Superdome or a big show like that, with angles where guys you're culminating a rivalry of some description with tag matches or stipulation matches or whatever, where there's an angle and a program behind everything. That was what they called a package show. And then it became a little harder to determine not only who was drawing the money, but also how guys got paid. And you've heard me mention that Watts would send out memos sometimes after the Superdome. I read one of them on the show here a while back, where he said that the Superdome payoffs were spread over X amount of people over the top 3 matches this time, because each of the 3 matches could be construed as a main event in its own right. And then it gets a little, and when Uncle Dave does a list, which he actually just did this past week in the Observer, does it every year, where he updates the list of biggest drawing cards in the history of wrestling year by year and then of all time, which is an estimate, a scholarly estimate, a learned estimate, but still just an estimate based on criteria that they've set up, whether it be Steve Yohe and the Clawmaster and all the historians that have compiled results and kept newspaper articles from the past alive and etc. that have contributed to this. They go, well, how many cards of over 10,000 fans did this guy headline in the course of a year? And where was the second place guy? That's why the all-time list is somewhat at the top. You're pretty good, right? It's not a fucking argument, Jim Londos. And the top couple, the Longsons and the Thezes, you can see it for the longevity, for decades and the huge crowds. When you get down a little bit, I always thought that a guy like Jackie Fargo got shortchanged in that formula because a guy in the Northeast Territory or a guy in a place like Dallas where they did have the big building, or a big city like Chicago where they had the big building, or a Sheik in Toronto was a huge drawing card, but he especially benefited from Maple Leaf Gardens being a big building because you could pinpoint all those people in these big shows drawing 10,000 or more people, but that might be once a month or once every couple, weeks. Whereas you had a guy for years at a time, like Fargo in the Tennessee Territory, drawing 5,000 people a week in Chattanooga, 5,000 people a week in Birmingham, more than that a week in Memphis or whatever. And those smaller towns would add up to, if there was record of, and if they were paid as much attention to, you see where I'm going with this, they would add up to probably comparable in some cases as the bigger, higher profile guys.
But let me ask you a question, though, because I think it's more in tune with the spirit of the email. The show where the Fargos returned, who did Zulu wrestle? Was that Zulu versus the Stomper?
The Mongolian Stomper, yes.
To argue over who drew that house.
Exactly. There is always the point you can make that, especially in the territories, when something else got hot or some other talent got hot, but you were still putting your heavyweight title or your, recognized top guy in the main event, even though the semifinal may have been the one they were interested in. And that case is the first time in 10 years more than 10 years, that all three of the Fabulous Fargos had been in the building together in the same place, same time in Memphis, was on the semifinal, and Zulu against the Mongolian Stomper for the Southern title was on the main event. Zulu got credit for 3 weeks in a row of sellouts at the Mid-South Coliseum because the Fargos were underneath all that time, but that's what they were coming to see. So it can be skewed. It's not an exact measurement or an exact calculation. Just because the guys in the main event, especially in some of these loaded shows, the people may have been coming to see the other guy. Over a period of time, it kind of evens out, where the promoters would usually be the ones to recognize so-and-so drew money because they were the ones that saw the bottom line, and they were the ones that saw the finances on every show, and they were the ones that were able to determine, when so-and-so's on the card for me, I do better than I do with anybody else or almost anybody else. As Sam Muchnick said, what didn't he say? His two of his three biggest drawing cards were Longson and Buddy Rogers. Was the other one Flair?
I'm not sure if it was.
I'm trying to think. It was two were vintage and one was more modern. But the point is that Sam Muchnick was in promotion for almost 40 years in one of the major markets in the country, and he could pinpoint the three guys that drew more money for him than anybody else over that long haul, because they had been there and done it time and time again. And then you'd have guys who, Andre didn't draw more money in each individual territory than the main event guys in the territories, but he drew more per capita per show that he was on. Because since he was always traveling around, you didn't get a chance to see him that often. He would pop a house in whatever territory he was in because they came to see him. But the area champion that was there for, 6 months straight drew more money overall, just not that one big house because he was programmed and regularly and on top and over whatever. That's why Jerry Jarrett always said that per capita, per event, the biggest drawing wrestler that he ever booked was Roughhouse Fargo. Because he'd only bring him in once every couple or 3 years, but fuck, it would sell out if he did. And you would find that, guys that were over in a territory would oftentimes outdraw the world heavyweight champion if they were in a hot angle or something, but that didn't mean that the world champion wasn't drawing more money than them in the entire country. See what I'm saying?
But like when you look at something like a WrestleMania today, or like a Smoky Mountain Wrestling Night of Legends, technically the main event was the 6-man tag match.
Right.
Should any of those wrestlers be given credit for drawing that house? And the same thing applies to a WrestleMania, unless it's something just over the top, like, Steve Austin's going to be teaming with zombie Buddy Rogers, and people care. Like, unless it's something crazy.
Yeah, no, the Night of Legends was a concept show, and there were so many big names in it and so many varieties of things people were interested in that it would be hard to give even the main event guys credit, but they were the most integral to the success of the wrestling event, which is why they were in the last match. But with WrestleMania, with anything today, you can't really tell because they go to see. It's like, which I've said this before, which Globetrotter team are we getting? Are we getting Metal Arc? We getting Curly Neal? We getting Geese Osby? Who are we getting? But we're still going to see the Globetrotters. We just hope that our favorites are there. They're going to see WrestleMania. They're going to see the spectacle. They're going to see the WWE live. The people on the show, with few exceptions, it doesn't really matter. Well, we've talked about it. If they announce Cena, that'll move tickets. If they announce Brock, that'll move tickets. Every once in a while, they'll announce something else that'll move some tickets, but otherwise, the people that decide when they first hear about the show, we're going to go, are the people that end up going. They don't even advertise. You watch the commercials for the WWE when they do commercials in a local market. See stars like this guy, that guy, and the other guy. They don't advertise matches anymore. Yeah. No. And I mean, that used to be, my God, most promoters, I know if Christine Jarrett saw that the opening match was going to be changed because somebody's car broke down or whatever, she would have the ring announcer apologize and be contrite about it because every single match on the card had been advertised not only on television, but in the newspaper. And if we didn't give them one, then that's false advertising. Now, and by the same token, if you hadn't given them any matches back then, nobody would have showed up. They would have said, what the fuck? You're just telling us to go see wrestling? We can see that every fucking week. We want to know who's wrestling. That determines whether we're going to go or not, unless we're just the devoted faithful that go every week. And that's what it is. So not advertising a match, then nobody's coming to see a match. And they advertise very few names, and then sometimes they change the names. So really right now, the only wrestler in the WWE, only wrestlers that sell any tickets that wouldn't be sold just because WWE's coming to town are Cena and Brock, and maybe to a lesser extent Roman. Is there anybody else? Can you think of anybody?
Right now, no.
Can you think of anybody that AEW puts on their shows that, in other words, is there anybody that serves the Cena position in AEW where we've had these tickets on sale, they've moved about all they're going to move, but we're going to add this name and suddenly, boom, more tickets? Is anybody doing that?
I think it depends on the market with AEW. To use Punk as an example, I think Punk returning into Chicago or New York is a lot different than Fresno.
Well, Punk can't return anywhere anymore because they ran him off.
Well, you know what I'm saying. I'm using him as an example.
But right now, is there anybody that stands out of the AEW pack? And I'm not even downgrading any of their talent. I'm just saying, is there anybody that they have available to them that they can add to a card that's already on sale and immediately bump up a bunch of tickets like Cena did for that last SmackDown or whatever? Is there any? I don't think so.
I mean, they probably have results that internally they know, but we don't know if an MJF, a Moxley, or any of these guys, Jericho, if they actually individually bump up any of these numbers.
Well, part of the reason is because they don't actually add these people afterwards. You just expect you're going to see them all. And then some of them don't show up and you're like, oh shit, so-and-so wasn't there.